So hello there guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. I hope that you guys are well, and what a finale that we just had to the United States Grand Prix, the Circuit of America in Austin, Texas, delivering once again that Formula One, particularly in the United States, definitely has a home at COTA. Of course, we had the earlier race in Miami, which had many stories going around the paddock. Much earlier in the season, mind you, we had a different taste of America in Austin, and it certainly left the appetites of many F1 fans fully replenished and fulfilled indeed, with Max Verstappen, of course, winning his 13th race of the season, winning in COTA for the second year in a row, confirming that Red Bull are the 2022 Formula One World Constructors Champions a couple of weeks after Max himself delivered the driver's title. But oh, it was a great finale. A race that started out to be a little bit stale, it must be said. In the early phases of the race, it seemed like Max Verstappen in formidable form. It seemed a bit like a procession, that not much was going to happen. But then, of course, a few incidents happened. The safety car came out. We had a classic drive from not only Lewis Hamilton, but also Sebastian Vettel as well, and a fight to the finish between two former rivals locking horns, ultimately won by the reigning defending world champion. Joining me on this podcast, as always, the DNF1 panel members, Courtney Pine and Lee Wallington. And before we get into reviewing the Grand Prix, guys, I do want to talk briefly in tribute to the sad passing of Dietrich Mateschitz, the co-founder of Red Bull, and a man who played a pivotal part into the Red Bull technologies, the Red Bull team in Formula One, of course, by extension, AlphaTauri, and obviously a huge playmaker in orchestrating what we know today as the Red Bull team in AlphaTauri, with the young drivers that have come through and had so much success in the sport, to be to such a sad loss in not only Formula One, but of course the world of the world of branding, I suppose, of Red Bull energy drinks, etc., etc. Guys, obviously I just want to get your thoughts on that sad news. We found out on Saturday, just before qualifying. Very sad news for everybody involved, and just a quick thoughts from you both about the sad passing of Dietrich Mateschitz.
Well, no, I think the biggest impact that I can sort of I want to highlight is obviously the amount of drivers that have come through. You know, I think most notably, Sebastian Vettel, Daniel Ricciardo, Carlos Sainz, obviously Verstappen's been the latest superstar to come through, and it's been the arrival of Red Bull has kind of changed, F1 in a sense. It's kind of created that academy system that we didn't really see in F1 as much. It had like sort of drivers being scouted, but Red Bull really started that junior F1 academies that we're now seeing Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari now do. So the arrival of Red Bull and the impact that Mateschitz has made has changed the face of F1 altogether.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Lee, what about you? What fond memories or what thoughts on the impact that Dietrich Mateschitz has had on F1 have resonated with you?
Well, I would further obviously agree with what Courtney said, but also expand it. It's not just the influence he had on Formula One, but motorsport in general. Or if you think to a wider range of motorsport, are the Red Bull young drivers that have come through the system that are world champions in their own right in other categories, in John-Eric Vergne and Sebastian Buemi. So that's impacts on different sports that just outside of Formula One. And I think today was a race that they would have really enjoyed to watch, obviously, as they got that Constructors Championship secured, and just a close racing. He was a racer at heart, although he worked in energy drinking. He loved his motorsport. So it was definitely a good way for the team to sign off in respect for, obviously, their co-founder passing away.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you both. And obviously echoing those thoughts that you both mentioned, the huge impact that he's had on not just Formula One, but obviously other motorsports as well, and plenty of success everywhere that the Red Bull brand has been affiliated with. And of course will be a very sad loss to everyone involved, not just at Formula One, but also Red Bull as well. So obviously our condolences we would love to send out to everyone, friends, family, everyone that knew Dietrich, and everyone that's obviously affected by the sad loss at this time. But as you both rightly pointed out, it was a fantastic Grand Prix, a race won ultimately by Max Verstappen, despite the sudden scare that he had towards the end of the race, where the Red Bull team, unsurprisingly, Actually, no, I shouldn't say unsurprisingly. Uncharacteristically is probably the better way of putting it. Messed up on his pit stop at such a critical moment, but was able to recover that, put in a great drive to recover that, and ultimately take the win, a narrow win away from Sir Lewis Hamilton, who would have obviously been a very deserving winner today and was so close. It just shows how well he is currently driving right now. But guys, of course, talking about the Grand Prix, we've only just finished watching the race late on a Sunday evening that we literally got straight away, hardly had much time to prepare. We're literally preparing for this podcast as we were watching the Grand Prix. So apologies if some of our thoughts are a bit fresh and a bit raw and perhaps lack a little bit of finesse that we like to try and add to the show with the benefit of time and preparation, as we normally do on these podcasts. But how can we sum up today's race? Because, I mean, I said already in the intro, it was a little bit stale at first. The start was obviously a bit spicy, a few events that we're going to talk about in a moment. The race did seem to look like it was going to fall into a bit of a procession with Max Verstappen running away with it, keeping the pack at arm's length almost. It never looked like he was really pushing. And then, of course, the safety car came out. It shuffled the pack a little bit, made things a little bit interesting on strategy. We saw a few surprises. Then we had, of course, a huge incident, which brought out another one. Then the race came alive. Lewis Hamilton with that late pit stop, forcing Red Bull's hand, which created the error from the Red Bull team. And then we saw that huge fight between Sir Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, a role reversal of last season as well, the cat and mouse chase. Ultimately, this time, instead of going the way that it did last year, Max Verstappen was able to get the move done this time around. How could you sum up the Grand Prix, perhaps a little bit better than I've just done?
I'm going to sort of cover three areas. I mean, first of all, yet again, Ferrari and Carlos Sainz being unlucky once again on a Sunday. That trend seems to be continuing. I think second of all, when we had the mistake that the pit crew made with Max, you touched on it earlier on, Adam. I think we was on the verge of falling asleep, and all of a sudden, hello, we've got ourselves a race here. We had that, and then obviously after that, and the events that followed on, I think we were seeing the kind of battles we were hoping to see a lot more often this season. Obviously, we saw Max Verstappen up against Charles Leclerc, and then obviously Max Verstappen up against Lewis. And for once, there was a battle where there wasn't too much controversy, and F1 Twitter isn't going to go into absolute mayhem afterwards. So we saw a battle between Max and Lewis that this time round that we probably would have hoped to see more often in 2021. Great battles on track. It stays on track. It doesn't go around on social media and intoxicate make the fan base toxic. But yeah, it really was a case of what we're hoping to see this season, and what I'm really, really hopeful we'll be able to see next season, because I do feel that on the grid right now, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton are the only two drivers that are able to challenge Max over the course of a season if they have the machinery to do so.
Yeah, I think what was great about today's race is because Max Verstappen had got that World Championship done, and I think in truth, whilst Red Bull, of course, winning the Constructors Championship today, sealing that one once and for all, in truth, it was always going to be a case of when rather than if. So it was really nice today to see a flat-out race between those three, obviously by extension, I suppose, more Sir Lewis and Max than Leclerc. In fairness, Leclerc was a part of it towards the end, but just never ultimately had the pace to keep up with the leading two. But it was nice to see them fighting with the gloves off and not having to worry about championship. I don't think that really crossed in either of their minds at this point. It certainly wouldn't have done in Max Verstappen. So it was nice to see a raw fight between those three. And the racing on track proved that it was firm but fair racing, I think, between all three of them. Some great battles. And I suppose the only sad part about all that is it was kind of a taste of what we could have had this year. If it wasn't for... I remember thinking to myself when Leclerc and Verstappen were fighting each other and they were going back and forth and the under and over at turn one. And I was thinking to myself, oh man, I'd seen this at the early part of the season. I remember this from Bahrain when them two were duking it, and I thought, who would have thought at the time that would have been as good as it had got all season? It would have been so nice for them to fight in the championship. But of course, we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves. It's a good point that you made, Courtney, at the start with Carlos Sainz. We should probably rewind back, because Carlos Sainz did start on pole position for this race, getting pole position outright, not having to rely on inheriting it from a penalty that his teammate received. And it's like Martin Brundle said on commentary, really. If Sainz had didn't have bad luck. He'd have no luck, really.
It's true.
The 100% win record from pole position is now officially gone, thanks to George Russell. I might add on that one. What did you guys make of the incident, Lee? And there was a lot of talk on commentary about, if Sainz had not sort of cut in a little bit ahead of George Russell, or if he hadn't avoided Verstappen. What were your thoughts on that incident? Was it a slam dunk penalty for George Russell?
I mean, I think it was pretty much a slam dunk penalty in that aspect. George saw a gap and went for it. Carlos obviously tried to avoid an accident with Max going around the outside, but it's on George to avoid the accident from what he could see, and obviously he didn't have enough time to react, or didn't react in time to not hit Carlos. So unfortunately, although he may have got a lenient punishment considering what the impact had on Carlos's race, it was still the first corner of the first lap, which probably gave it a bit more lenient, but it is consistent with other punishments for causing a collision. But he definitely caused that collision. I don't think there's much argument in blaming it on Carlos at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one at turn one, isn't it? Because the way that the corner sort of goes is that Sainz technically had the racing line going into the corner, but there's such a wide berth, and obviously the hill where the corner undulates and you're going downhill after all, it does look like you have to cut across the line for someone on the inside. So you really do have to hope that there's no one steaming up the inside of you when you make the move that Sainz was obviously had to make. And as you pointed out, Lee, he did have to avoid Verstappen because Verstappen was a little bit slow going out of turn one after making the overtake into turn one on Sainz. That if Russell doesn't make the corner like he didn't, he just drives into the side of him. I mean, you could argue that if Sainz wasn't there's a risk he may have gone into his teammate as well. It was just luckily for Hamilton, there was a Ferrari in between the two of them. So, Corny, what did you make? Do you agree with Lee's analysis of the incident?
Yeah, I think the fact that it was a first lap incident, I think obviously led to the penalty being lower, but I can understand the frustration from Ferrari fans and Carlos Sainz in particular, because obviously he had his race ruined. But I think with George Russell, look, I've been a George Russell fanboy on this podcast, but we were talking about this on the group chat. George Russell does have that element to he can be a little bit rash sometimes when it comes to defending and overtaking. That's probably the one area where I think George really needs to finesse that if he wants to be challenging for championships in the future. Because let's say, hypothetically speaking, Mercedes improve and they produce a race-winning car, he's going to be racing up against the likes of Verstappen, his teammates Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc. Ferrari could be stronger next season. So if George Russell wants to be a championship contender in the next season or so, he's going to have to finesse that, or he's going to find himself dropping a lot of points. We know that George has the ability. We know George has, he has a maturity about him, generally speaking, beyond his years. But it's just that slight, this is me being overly critical, that's the one element of George's driving craft, shall we say, that he just needs to finesse if he wants to go up to that next level and we start comparing him to the greatest of this generation.
Yeah, I agree with that quite a lot. And, for anyone that listens to this show and knows my interest in Formula One, of course, I like to try and be as objective as I can, but obviously I do want to see the Ferraris do well. So understandably, I was going to be a bit more annoyed about this than others. But that being said, I've been a very big supporter of George Russell. I like what he's doing. I think he's a very, very talented driver. But I am starting to get a little bit annoyed of the lack of accountability on his part. This is a guy that is very open when he makes mistakes or where things needs to be improved. He's very methodical. He's very intelligent. I think it's a man much more mature than the shoulders that his head currently rests on at this point in time. And I think the talent speaks for itself. This guy is the real deal. The problem is that I sometimes feel in these moments that George Russell doesn't always seem to take into account the certain situation that he's in. This is a similar situation. This is a situation he's actually been in a few times this year. In France with Sergio Perez when he was trying to squeeze up the inside when he shouldn't have really been there. Obviously, Austria, he did something similar, but to his credit, that wasn't his fault. But, being in that situation that time. Singapore, he was caught up in quite a few incidents, and every single time it was always on the other person, or they're doing this or they're doing that. Not suggesting that a driver's always going to hold their hands up in the heat of battle, in the heat of the moment, saying, oh, actually, I messed up there. But there have been some obvious occasions where George really, you think that he doesn't need to say anything, or you can just hold his hands up and he just goes straight to saying, oh, the other person did this, the other person did that. Today, whilst I accept it's a first lap incident, first corner, and the cars are fully loaded with fuel, the brakes are going to be cold, the tyres are going to be cold, you do need to take that into account when you're going into the corner at turn one, especially at COTA. There's always going to be opportunity. And George misjudged that braking point by quite some margin. As I said already, I don't think it's much to exaggerate that if Sainz wasn't there, there's a chance he could have drove into the back of his teammate. And then it would have been a much bigger issue for him that ultimately was. But those are my 2 cents on it. I just think that George Russell of late, this is not something that surprised me. It's just something that he's been doing quite a bit of late. And I think something he personally needs to address in order to avoid that becoming a bigger problem, as you mentioned, Courtney, in the future, when Mercedes will have a car, hopefully, that will be fighting for race wins and championships on a regular basis. I want to kind of change the conversation a little bit on this one, and not because George Russell was drove into the side of a Ferrari, therefore I'm going to take this opportunity to try and make it a relevant subject. I think it's something that a lot of people have been calling for some time. And I want to compare this to another incident as well, because 5-second penalties tend to be for an incident like we saw with Latifi much later in the race with Mick Schumacher, where he tried to defend the position against him, drove into the side of him, Schumacher went wide, had to sort of get out of it. It's a little bit dangerous from Latifi. It's a 5-second penalty causing a collision. In theory, by offering the same punishment to George Russell for what he did with Carlos Sainz, he basically took Sainz out of the race. You know, obviously he didn't intend to, but he damaged Sainz's car to such a degree where Sainz had to retire, had a water leak, but got the same punishment. Now, I don't want to sort of be a little bit overdramatic here, but I do feel sometimes there is scope and there is an element of truth to some, or legitimacy to some fans thinking that perhaps not necessarily offer retrospective penalties in this case, like they do like grid penalties or talking to the stewards or stuff like that. But I do feel that sometimes the impact that you have on the victim of your accident that you're at fault of, what happens to them should be relevant sometimes in the decision making that stewards make when they're throwing out penalties, providing that it's a short enough amount of time where it's actually relevant. So in this case, where Sainz taken out of the race, I think is probably a relevant amount of time almost immediately, not say someone's race is ruined 20 laps later as a result of something that happened all the way back then. I think so much happens in the race where you can't really go back and review that to the point where it's fair. What are you guys' thoughts on this? Because this, as I said, this is something that's been brought up quite a few times in different incidents. Should the outcome of an incident, in terms of what happens to the victim of an incident, have an effect on what level of punishment is given to the driver that is, in this case, committing the incident?
Personally, I don't think that should be taken into consideration. You have a rule and what are criteria for causing a collision, and that the suitable punishments for causing a collision are obviously based on previous decisions that have been made. I don't think that the outcome should be taken into consideration. You take it into a court of law, how the victim is impacted. Sometimes it's taken into consideration, but more often than not, it's the crime itself that's punished, not the how it's affected the victim that the punishment is given to the offender. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer. I can't actually vouch for that. I know legal circumstances. It's just my understanding of it. I think that should be a simple case of law broke or rule broken, punishment given, not the outcome of the offending incident. That's my thoughts anyway.
No, that's a fair point. Courtney, what about you?
Yeah, it's a tough one, you know, because you have got the different sort of, you know, the different scenarios, and you're right, you have to take on, you know, the impact that it has on the other driver. Like, it has to be considered. But let's be honest, look how much time we've probably spent throughout the course of this season talking about, you know, the decision making from the governing bodies of this sport. Like, let's be honest, like this is just a cherry on the really a disgusting cake that's just been making us feel sick throughout the course of the season. It's like right now, I'm just talking on a personal perspective. him. I have very little trust in any of the decisions that the stewards make in general. I'm feeling very disillusioned by the sport in general. I'm not going to go too down because we do get accused of moaning a lot on this podcast, but I'm not surprised at all that we're even having this debate or there's even this sense of confusion about what the correct penalty is, because it just seems that the governing bodies change their minds or their feelings on how somebody should be punished for something on the day. Like, it just seems to change day by day. So am I surprised that there's confusion about George's penalty? Not at all, in all honesty.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to in my mind, either, should there be scope for something like this where that, they do, as I said, if it's relevant and it's a short amount of time after the incident has happened, where, as I said, the driver, in this case, Carlos Sainz, just for a lack of a better way of calling him just the victim, has been taken out of the race. And as I said, ultimately, because of that, Ferrari will obviously naturally feel really aggrieved because Mercedes have gained ground on him in the Constructors' Championship. And you could argue that a fair case that if Carlos Sainz, even if he drives with a damaged car, perhaps could have pulled it home to P6, Ferrari still probably they'd be close. They wouldn't outscore Mercedes, but it'd be a lot closer to them than it would have been without him in that race. And it's ultimately Mercedes have ultimately gained an advantage here through something that one of their drivers has done. Now, again, I'm just using this as a isolated example. There are probably other examples where you could apply this same logic that have happened throughout this season and others before that. I mean, we can only cast our minds back to Silverstone last year, just another example. And obviously, Lewis got a much harsher penalty for doing, well, obviously not, the same sort of incident, but took a collision with a driver that took him out of the race. That Lewis was punished for by the stewards. They deemed that he was at fault in that incident, and they gave him a much harsher penalty. So, it's a hard one. For me, I feel like there has to be more scope to not judge an incident like Latifi and Mick Schumacher's today and Russell and Sainz's and award the same penalty for both. What that scope is, I don't know.
Maybe it's because Ferrari don't have the whinging power that Red Bull have. I'm just putting it out there.
Oh god, here we go.
Maybe that's something. Maybe that's something that Ferrari need to. No, it's true. If you think about it, Toto Wolff and Christian Horner are great at getting what they want because they know how to moan. I don't know. Maybe Ferrari a little bit too nice behind the scenes, and maybe that's a part of the problem. It just seems that Ferrari, even though for years and years and years, Ferrari were were known for having the first call on things, having the overpowering vote and any decisions are going to get made. But right now, the way I see it, I think the sport is being sort of. I think Christian Horner in particular and Toto Wolff to a certain extent, they're the ones that sort of have the bigger sort of power over decisions that are being made. I do think Ferrari are kind of losing their voice over the last few seasons. That's just my personal opinion. So maybe that could well be, something to consider when these kind of incidents happen involving Ferrari drivers.
Yeah. I do want to also add that I think, as you mentioned, Courtney, consistency in the rulings is key. Mm-hmm. And if you take into consideration how it impacts every driver in the situation, you take away consistency because then it all becomes isolated little incidents. You have no consistency because every incident is different, which then potentially causes more confusion to fans. Why has this happened? Because that driver had that impact on that car, and that driver then that didn't, so we're going to give a 7.5, 6 here, 3 here, and it just makes the situation a whole lot more confusing, which the fans don't want confusing. They want nice, simple rules that understand and equal this punishment. Then it's that, which we don't get anyway, but we don't want it to be even more confusing.
Well, I mean, we had an example of consistency today, didn't we, with Gasly, where he got that, originally got the 5-second time penalty for being more than 10 car lengths away from the safety car, or in this case, the car that was ahead of him in the safety car queue. I mean, I thought that was a little bit harsh looking at the onboard replay, given how fast these Formula 1 cars can go. I mean, he clearly was in breach of that. So, the rules are the rules, as I've said on this show many times before, so it's a fair cop. But the only reason why they gave him that penalty, in my opinion, was because they did the same to Perez in Singapore, although albeit lightly under the circumstances. They didn't seem to need to pull him into the stewards room after the race to talk to him. They seemed to be quite happy to give him a penalty straight then and there. So, but
that's lack of consistency. They should have pulled here into the stewards room to talk to him after the
well,
race.
maybe.
I'm
But
telling you, trust me. It's all about the voices behind the scenes. Trust me.
maybe
I
Ferrari
do.
needs to bring back Jean Todt. He's
It's
looking for.
true
He
though.
might need
Like
a job. He's not the FIA president anymore. Bring
it's
him back.
true. It really. Trust me. I do believe that right now, like, after last season, I just think that just really opened up a can of worms. I just think right now the decision makers, for me, they just come across as too weak for my liking. They just seem to be influenced by the team principals and the managers of some of these teams. And I just think that's why we've got this situation where the F1 fan base seems to be at war with each other, becoming more like a football rivalry. And it's something that needs to be dealt with very soon because the sport's becoming more and more poisonous. So either Ferrari need to adapt to the situation and get their voice back, or the people at the top need to sort their out and actually cut out the slack from the team principals. They cut out the live feed from the team principals, and that was a good. I really agreed that. Even though it was funny to see Christian Horner and Toto walk on the blower for most of the season, it was good that they got rid of that because it lessened the influence. But I think that needs to happen more because I do believe, like I've said it a couple of times already, I do feel there are one or two people in this sport that have way too much of an influence on the decisions that are made by the FIA.
Yeah, true. I mean, ultimately what it comes down to for me is I feel like there should be more. I don't know. There should be more scenarios where you can actually apply certain penalties depending on what has happened. I think perhaps it's too. I don't know. I just think it's too simplistic. I know we don't want too much complexity. We want things to be easier for fans to understand. But I do feel like, I don't know, maybe this is coming off raw because this has happened to one of the drivers that I normally support, but because this is a scenario where the same punishment has been handed out for two separate incidents, one in which it was basically two drivers coming together because the other one's forced him a bit wide, and they both carried on, no harm, no foul, 5-second penalty, fair enough, and the other one has basically gone in too deep into turn one, basically hit another driver, spun him around, ruined his race, and you only get 5 seconds. I mean, the incident I mentioned already from last year, Sir Lewis got a 10-second time penalty, which I think was probably a more fairer punishment under the scenario. But it's just, I suppose it's open for debate. And obviously, guys, I want you guys to mention in the comments your thoughts on this. Do you think we should have more, what's the right word? More, I don't know, branches for scenarios where different levels of penalties can be offered depending on the outcome of an incident, or if you feel like the outcome of an incident should be relevant really in terms of what penalty is awarded. Let us know your thoughts on that one. Let's move on, because I've talked a lot already about George Russell's race, and I mean, and despite that, he had a bit of damage with his car, which obviously hampered his pace, and he did a good job, I think, to keep it going in P5. He, got the fastest up at the end of the race, so there was still some pace in that car clearly, and it's a good chunk of points for Mercedes, which ultimately has allowed them to close the gap on Ferrari in the Constructors Championship. I think the gap between them now is, 53 points? I believe that's right. Yeah, 53 points. So still a gap in Ferrari's favour right now. I think Leclerc played a huge part in trying to mitigate the damage there, but it's certainly not over for Mercedes. P2's still on, but there's still some more they're going to have to do in the races that remain. I do want to talk about Sir Lewis Hamilton today. And whilst, of course, naturally we'll talk about Red Bull a little bit later on, I don't think that we can ignore that despite the fact that he didn't win the Grand Prix, he certainly drove like a 7-time world champion that's won over 100 Grand Prix. And yeah, as I said already, guys, I think this was Sir Lewis Hamilton's best performance of the season by far. He was phenomenal today. He drove the wheels off that Mercedes, and even when Max Verstappen managed to make that move on him at the very end, he was still pushing him. There was still that part that thought, this ain't over. One mistake or one more track limits violation from Max Verstappen. And we had a phase where Lewis was literally reporting every turn where Max was going slightly wide, whilst driving around himself and trying to keep him honest and trying to re-overtake him. So fair play to him for that one. Of course, almost getting a track limits violation or track limits penalty himself in the process. So, they did push their limits, but no, what a great drive from Sir Lewis Hamilton. And there's not much more that you think that he can really do to win a Grand Prix without actually winning one this season.
No, it's just the Mercedes is just too far behind this season. It's for a team that's obviously set the standard that they have since 2014, they will be disappointed if all the teams follow the regulations fairly next season, then hopefully, Mercedes will be able to challenge fairly with Red Bull and Ferrari being in the mix as well. And with the driver pairing that Mercedes have, you put them as one of the favourites to win the championship next season. But yeah, I think another example from Lewis this weekend, where the whole Lewis Hamilton is a finished driver brigade. I think he's well and truly silenced them once again. And obviously, you get the other people saying Lewis Hamilton's only good in a fast car. Today was an example that he was wringing a neck out of the car that he simply isn't good enough to win a race. Of course, Max Verstappen's slow pit stop helped to an extent, but no, we saw the Lewis Hamilton that we used to seeing. We saw at the beginning of the season that Lewis was experimenting a lot with the car, sort of sacrificing his own setup to find the answers to what's the issue with the car. And had a lot of people saying, "Oh, George Russell's way ahead of Lewis Hamilton in the driver standings. Does this mean Lewis is finished and George is a better driver?" And I was saying back then, Lewis is trying to find the answers and he's sacrificing his setup in order to find the answers. And I think we're seeing this. I think now they've sort of found out the issues with the car and they'll take it on to 2023. We're now seeing a sort of natural order reestablish itself where Lewis is getting the maximum points that he can with the car that he has. And, he had the sniff of the win. And we saw that desire come back. We saw the Lewis Hamilton of 2021, where it's like any opportunity to gain an advantage, he was after. I mean, you know what? That was one of the features that actually made this race interesting tonight.
Yeah, I think so too. Especially the part where Max had got past Lewis Hamilton, that, Lewis didn't fade away. I mean, ultimately, obviously, he gave up the ghost once he knew he wasn't going to be able to get Max at the end and just wanted to preserve P2 because of the Constructors Championship. But it was nice to see him hanging around. He wasn't giving up. It wasn't a case of, oh, Max has got him, the race is over. He stuck with him. And perhaps, as you said, Corny, it's that point where Sir Lewis sees the car ahead of him, sees the victory there, and the chase is on, and he feels motivated to go to those depths of which that hardly anybody in the world of Formula One history has ever really reached before. And it does bode well for those of you Sir Lewis Hamilton or Mercedes fans that are hoping that next year's W14 is going to be up there with the Red Bull and the Ferrari that is produced next season and fights for the championship, that Sir Lewis Hamilton is going to be up there and fighting form rather than being not necessarily a shell of his former self, but not the guy that has won 7 world championships. So that's always a really good sign, and it was great to see. Lee, adding on to our thoughts on today from Sir Lewis Hamilton, how did you sum up his day?
It was a really enjoyable race for his part and the effort put in. And it was for almost, especially the second half of the race, you could have almost thought we were in last year of Max and Lewis, and Lewis chasing down Max, and then Max chasing down Lewis. And it's like, is it 2021 or are we in 20? Obviously, the Red Bull is the better car. I'm not denying, but they're just that. We haven't had a lot of time where Lewis and Max have been fighting for the win. It's been Charles or Max or Sergio or Carlos or Max, and it's not really had. Lewis hasn't had that opportunity to be up that far and fighting with Max. So it was really good to see from Mercedes and Lewis that they're there. They're not quite there yet, but they definitely had some fun today.
Yeah, I think so too. And an aggressive Mercedes is always a good Mercedes for Formula One. And look, I'm a Ferrari fan, so I don't mind saying this, but there's always something about Ferrari that they just don't really have compared to Red Bull and Mercedes right now. And it's not necessarily not that they're good right now, but if Ferrari have a car capable of winning Grand Prix or fighting for world championships, it's always enjoyable to see. But perhaps more for me than others. But with Red Bull and Mercedes, when they're under the cosh or when they have a chance that they can win a race, when they don't often get in that position because they're just not up to it, when they're aggressive on strategy, it's so much more fun to watch because they really do try and force something out of a race. I mean, today could have been one of those days after I think Sir Lewis made his first stop where it would have been like, well, he's made his stop, the safety car's come out, that's kind of neutralised the race for him and kind of hindered him. He's stuck behind the Aston Martins and Charles Leclerc, who are all on different strategies compared to him. So it's probably going to be a bit of a procession. But that last stop, I think it was lap 35, which come out of the blue a little bit. I think people were probably considering trying to go to the end after the two safety cars, thinking they probably could, although that would have been quite the fight. I mean, Kevin Magnussen, we saw firsthand how difficult that was, and he still got points for it, fair play to him. But that second pit stop really forced the final stages of the race. It forced Red Bull's hand on strategy. It was an aggressive play for Mercedes, and it ultimately brought out the excitement and nearly won the Grand Prix for them. I just don't see Ferrari really being able to do that. And even when they try to force it, it's almost just a case of, well, we've got nothing to lose, might as well try, but we know it's not going to work. And it never really does for them. Red Bull just cancel it out, or they have something in them. But something about when Mercedes and when Red Bull do it to each other, it's so much more fun. I really hope Ferrari can get there, but it was fun today. And obviously, you know, it gave us that final chapter of the race where we saw Max and Lewis finding it out to the end of the Grand Prix. It's just something I wanted to add in there, really. I don't know what you guys think about that, if you agree or if you feel perhaps I'm being a bit too harsh on Ferrari, but it just seems that Mercedes and Red Bull, it's always more fun when they do that.
No, but I mentioned this earlier on in the season, you know, when we started to see Ferrari making those big decisions that swung the pendulum in Red Bull's favour, it is that lack of championship winning experience within that team. Obviously, between Red Bull and Mercedes have completely dominated F1 over the last 12 years. Ferrari haven't won the championship since 2008, where they won the Constructors. And I just think that lack of championship winning experience as a team unit, 'cause I'm sure they've brought in people from Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren, etc., because we know that's how it happens in Formula One. But as a complete team, a complete unit, they don't have that championship winning experience that Mercedes and Red Bull have. So Red Bull, Mercedes have not only that experience, but have that confidence because of the experiences that they've had to make those bold decisions that pays off for them. And I do think these are the kind of experiences that Ferrari need to get if they want to win championships, because look, they are the biggest team in Formula One. They've got obviously, you look at some of the drivers they had. You have a look at the Schumacher era where they completely wiped the floor with the opposition. It's there. They've got the setup, but I just think they need to get that next championship under their belts and rebuild. I think Ferrari are still on the rebuild after their collapse from 2014 onwards.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Lee, what do you think is the secret really in terms of this aggressive strategy? Because as I said already, when Red Bull and Mercedes play these aggressive strategies, they do tend to work out for them more often than not. And it's to the point where it surprises everybody. They seem to be like, well, they're going for something, no one quite sees it, and then it sort of works out for them. When Ferrari do it, it's almost a case of, oh, well, they're just going for broke here, but we know it's not going to work out. It's like the obvious thing to do.
I think it comes down to two things, really. It's sad as it's going to say, your strategic computer and simulating software and experience with your strategist, that you know when to make the right choice based on the predictions from your computer. And as Courtney just touched on, Ferrari don't have a lot of good experience on that. And they don't have the experience of making the good judgments. So they've got nothing as a individual or a strategical team to go, and yeah, we did this. This was a great choice and we can do it again. No, they don't have that confidence in their decision making. They probably still have just as good a computer and software as Mercedes and Red Bull. But it's the strategical team, I think, and the experience that they have and the confidence in the decision, which I think Ferrari are lacking in that sense. And as we've said throughout the season, Ferrari are really lacking in the personnel and the experience and the cohesion as a unit. And that still just plays out throughout this season and probably into next season.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, we'll have to wait and see how it goes. Obviously, they're still a young team, so we have to see how that persists in the coming races and obviously next season as well. We should talk about Charles Leclerc. On a more positive note for Ferrari, this was a weekend where obviously they would have hoped for a bit more than this, but ultimately, you know, with Carlos Sainz, we weren't sure what he was going to be able to do today, but I'm sure he would have been in the thick of it. Charles Leclerc recovering from P12 after a 10-place grid drop because of a new power unit in his car. And yeah, I would say I think he'd be pretty happy with the outcome of the race today. I mean, ultimately, he would have wanted more points for the team. Didn't quite have the pace towards the end of the race to fight Max and Sir Lewis Hamilton, but, you know, rode his luck with the safety car, played the strategy pretty well when the opportunity presented itself to him and managed to get himself on the podium and pulled off some great overtakes at the same time, particularly on Sergio Perez. Was a fantastic overtake from him to get ahead of him. Obviously, a bit of a moment between the two of them where Perez outbraking himself into turn 12, forcing Charles to take evasive action to avoid a contact, having to give the place back, but then obviously getting him a little bit later on. Good drive from Charles Leclerc today. His first podium, mind you, after starting outside the top 7, which is something that surprised me, but a good result all round for Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, we said earlier on, we got a glimpse from Charles Leclerc that what we were hoping to see more often this season. I think he still has this horrible knack of, being fantastic on a Saturday, but then everything goes wrong on a Sunday. So, look, as neutral fans, we want to be seeing the best drivers at their best because then we get the most entertainment and then we get championship battles that go on to the end of the season. So I'm hoping that Ferrari in particular and Charles Leclerc do fine-tune the issues that they've learned from this season, because if Mercedes are struggling again next season, Charles Leclerc and Ferrari are going to be our best hope of giving us an entertaining championship next year.
Yeah, very much so. And, it can only be said that this is the sort of thing that we hope will happen, where Ferrari did start off quite promising for them, but obviously owing to mistakes from the drivers, and, on top of that, not being able to really deliver on strategies or in positions where they have been good, that has ultimately been an issue for them this season. So, a result like today, they'll be happy with Leclerc's performance. They would obviously want a little bit more, perhaps P2 in the Constructors, whilst Mercedes have got to be a little bit closer. I still think Ferrari, it's theirs to lose at this point, but you never really know. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. Lee, final thoughts on Leclerc before we move on?
It was a very good recovery drive from Charles. I mean, he's known for his speed, but he isn't really known for these recovery drives. Lewis and Max have done some solid recovery drives in this year or previous seasons, but it's not something that's really you see from Charles. So it's a new talent, or not new talent, but a new skill he's developing or working on. But it's nice to see that he's adding that skill to his repertoire, to his assets. So when he's again involved in a championship fight, and everyone has to do a recovery drive when in a championship fight because something happens and they need to come from back, he's now got that skill to do a solid recovery drive, and it was really impressive for him to bring that and show that today.
Yeah, very much so. Couldn't agree more on that one. Let's talk about Red Bull briefly with their drives, because we haven't spoken too much about Max Verstappen, but of course another incredible recovery from him. It seemed at the start of the race that he was going to run away with it after a great start to get into the lead from P2. And then, of course, the safety cars came out. He had to do quite a bit of battling, a little bit of a fight with Charles Leclerc, which ultimately he won out, and then closing down Sir Lewis Hamilton to eventually get that overtake on him towards the end of the race and keep it all on the track, avoiding any more track limits breaches, because he was on the limit, as was Sir Lewis Hamilton, of course, we should mention, to get the victory. 13 wins for the season now, tied with Sebastian Vettel and Michael Schumacher for the most Grand Prix victories in a Formula 1 season. 3 races to go. Max only needs to win one more to have the outright record. Probably would be a brave man or woman to bet against him from doing that.
Yeah, he'll probably win the last 3 races, given what we've been seeing. But yeah, I think with Max's race altogether, I literally just thought of it because it's how my brain works. The best way to describe Max's race, it was a bit like a race in Mario Kart. He's leading the race easily, going to the final lap, goes into the pit stop, gets hit by a blue shell. That's what happened. He got hit by a blue shell to make it more entertaining for the rest of us. And he did well. Look, the Red Bull's in a league of its own, but at the end of the day, he still had the determination. I've always admired that about Max. He's always had that determination to win. He's already wrapped up the championship, but he still wanted to win that race today. And it did contribute. It was as much I would have loved to have seen someone else win today, but it did contribute to what was a good race today. So fair play to Max for that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that one. And Sergio Perez, we should talk about him as well, Lee. So obviously had a grid place penalty of his own, and recovered it all the way to P4. Had a few nice battles on track, obviously with Charles Leclerc, a race-long battle with George Russell as well, which ultimately he came out on top. Despite the fact that he had a little bit of damage, there was a point in the race where I did feel that Perez was going to potentially challenge Sir Lewis Hamilton and try and preserve that lead for Max, but ultimately faded away and fell back towards George Russell, who also had a damaged car. I mean, how would you sum up his day? I suppose it's a bit of a 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, really.
Yeah, I think Sergio's day, well, it was obviously a very good drive, considering the damage he has, but it's one of those questions or one of those drives of, you're missing a part of your car, but you're still one of the fastest cars on the circuit. What benefit does that missing part give? And we see it sometimes throughout the years, and it's obviously a very important part of the car, but Sergio was driving brilliantly. And yeah, there was some really good racing he had with George, close, fair racing, and it was just a really good, solid performance. I think, unfortunately, his tyres started to go off towards the end, especially obviously missing that extra downforce does hurt the tyre wear. But it was just a really solid drive from him. And yeah, obviously it was a shame for him being effectively a second home Grand Prix for him, not to be on the podium. But it was just a really solid drive from him, and you can't blame him or accuse him of anything wrong. It was just a really clean drive, and obviously the bit of contact with it was Valtteri at the beginning, wasn't it? Was it Valtteri?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
He did not perfect drive for the rest of the race. It's just that little bit of contact that caused that little bit of damage. But yeah, can't criticise him at all. Not that I want to. I should say.
No, we don't want to, obviously. We have to try and be fair where we can. But although some people that listen to this show have different interpretation of what we deem as fair in our analysis of certain drivers, which, is understandable, really. We all have our own opinions on these things. That's always the fun about it, really. They're only opinions. That's all that matters. But, it's with Perez, yeah, I agree with that one. There were a few good moments. Obviously, it was a nice battle with George Russell when they were going through the S's. I thought that was pretty cool. Ultimately winning that one out, quite brave there. And I think in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to matter too much. It's more personal pride at this point. And the Constructors Championship is wrapped up, and he has played a big part in that as well. It's not just all about Max Verstappen. In P3 in the Drivers' Championship now, Leclerc's just got ahead of him again. So, if he finishes P2 this year, you can't really ask for much more than that from Sergio Perez. And he's certainly still in the frame for that one. I'm sure he'll be very, very much invested in trying to get that done. I'm hoping, for Red Bull's sake, that Max Verstappen might be interested in trying to help him with that where he can, because that's literally the only thing there is to do now, although Max has his own personal accolades and always drives the race, particularly at the end of that race. I think we saw a guy that was racing as if he'd never won a Grand Prix before, let alone someone.
That's the thing.
And that's the thing, yeah. So we'll see on that one. I do want to bring up stuff going on with the budget cap. Now, I know some of you guys listen to this show have said to us, oh, you're a bit tired of us talking about this budget cap thing. The reality is, guys, this is something that is constantly developing and is still probably the biggest talking point in Formula One right now. So we'd be stupid to not talk about the latest developments on this. And we've gotten some regarding what the FIA wanted to do. Originally, they wanted to impose a penalty, according to the German publication Amus, was a penalty that they were going to cut Red Bull's development time on the ATR regs by 25%, meaning that they'd have 25% less wind tunnel time than they would have been normally allocated for next season. And they would have also received a fine, which of course would have been absolutely huge for them in terms of a punishment. I mean, I'm not an aerodynamicist, but losing 25% wind tunnel time is a massive amount of time, which obviously was intended to allow the field to try and catch them up. Red Bull, from what we heard, rejected this, and then they were in regular meetings and negotiations with the FIA on this. I think we heard meetings between Christian Horner and Mohammed Ben Sulayem negotiating on an appropriate penalty that Red Bull would accept in terms of their budget cap breach. Now, Christian Horner has gone out publicly and said that the actual breach was around a few 100,000 overspend rather than the 1.8 million figure. But the one thing that sticks with me is whether this reported penalty that was offered to Red Bull, which they rejected from what I've heard, and negotiations will understandably continue in the week following the passing of Dietrich Mateschitz, where all that has been delayed for the time being, because apparently the FIA were ready to announce something this weekend, and out of respect for them, they've not done that yet. What I don't understand is, and maybe this is a bit rich coming from a Ferrari fan, but where do we get off on all of a sudden being able to negotiate what penalty that we receive? That seems a bit strange, doesn't it?
Look, the difference with the Ferrari thing is that Ferrari did get punished for it. Yes, they do get punished with, having points deducted or having, you know, let's say they were to win the championship, they had the championship taken away. They were punished on performance. So they got the punishment they deserved for the, perceived breach of regulations that they seem to have broken. So Ferrari did get punished. Look, I'm as sick of this whole situation as everyone else is, and I'm sure the pair of you are as well. But the reason why we're sick of it is because it's been dealt with so badly. Like for me, we knew. We've spoken about this so much. We just had this bad feeling it was going to get brushed underneath the carpet, and look where we are today. It's been brushed underneath the carpet, and as I say, like I'm completely disillusioned by how this sport is run. I cannot take this sport seriously when we're seeing stuff like this happen.
I think the big problem, and this is where I think Red Bull have a little bit of leverage in this situation, and perhaps why negotiations are sort of not necessarily taking place right now, but negotiations have been taking place over what an appropriate punishment that Red Bull would accept from the FIA. And that was owing to some misunderstandings from the FIA's perspective in certain cost classifications, which is why Red Bull were being audited or certain things were happening around June time. The sort of things that Toto Wolff was talking about when he's saying they were under investigation in June. There were some misunderstandings there, apparently from the FIA side, which caused them to change a few things, which all of a sudden put Red Bull in a position, from Red Bull's perspective, where they were over the budget cap or they were at risk of doing this, stuff like that. So it's all a bit confusing, all a bit strange right now. It's evident that the FIA have obviously, it feels like they've messed up in some regard with handling this budget cap situation, which may allow Red Bull to find loopholes to sort of get a lighter punishment or perhaps get away. I'm not suggesting here that that Red Bull are trying to get away with this. I should be careful with how I put this, but it does feel right now that there are going to be more questions than answers resulting from this, and that this has created leeway, which has allowed Red Bull to try and lever themselves a more fairer punishment in their opinion, or perhaps not even a punishment at all, if they think their interpretation is correct, which is, of course, going to be a problem when everybody, whether it be podcasters or YouTubers, not necessarily us, but pundits and other teams in team principals have been smearing them to the point where Christian Horner is basically claiming that the children of some Red Bull staff are being abused and bullied at school because they know their parents are working with Red Bull, and there's obviously a stigma attached with that. Now, no, I'm not quashing those rumours or saying that Christian is chatting rubbish or saying he's on the money. I don't know, so I can't really comment on that. But it's just showing right now that this whole situation, without the clarity that we were also desperately hoping we were going to get, is lacking massively. And this is creating more problems going forward. Lee, what are your thoughts on this situation?
Well, I do disagree with the principle of negotiating a punishment, and I said it to you guys in our chat of, I'm bringing up the legal example again, is if you get sentenced for a crime in a court of law, you don't get to negotiate with the judge your punishment. The punishment sentences you, and that is it. There's no, but I don't like that. Could you give me community service instead of sentencing me to prison for 5 years or whatever it is? You don't get that kind of negotiation. So for a governing body to negotiate a punishment does seem a bit odd for me. But I also want to throw a question back to you both of now, with the bad press Red Bull were getting, and the unfortunate passing of Matish's, the tie owners, I think Chaleo, if I pronounced that correctly, and his family that own the other share Red Bull, who aren't too keen into motor racing anyway, getting all this bad publicity to the Red Bull brand, will they consider selling or pulling Red Bull out because they don't care about motorsport? Because that was Matish's passion. So, could there potentially be a bigger overall picture that now be looking in the background, going on that high up in Red Bull, that could actually have an impact on this Formula One as a whole, and the FIA is concerned that there could be a potential impact on the sport?
Well, this is why I'm saying I think we have to be very careful with how, not necessarily us personally, how we choose our words with this, but a lot of stuff that has been said. And Christian Horner's right to point out that a lot of people have had their say on this incident without knowing all the facts. You know, there's been a lot of rumours going around the paddock too saying that, you know, we heard information, someone had leaked out information of two teams being investigated, and ultimately that turned out to be correct. So there is a concern there, but we just have to be, I think until the information is clear for everybody, I think we have to be mindful about what's being said right now, because it does have an impact, a real world impact, that Red Bull as an energy brand could feel that they need to take legal action to sort of recover any damage to their brand as a result.
I mean, you're right. I think, but this is, I'm going to get sort of deep about like real world issues here, but this is an example of the world that we live in today. So we'll have examples of like something that will annoy us or something that we feel is wrong, but because of the way that social media works and everything else, because of that, everything gets blown out of proportion, and you do get situations where you hear of employees' children being bullied and stuff like that. There's always seems to be people that take things too far. So we'll have a moan on a podcast, but then there will be people that always take it to like the next step or next 3 steps. And I say, and the F1 community is becoming more like the football community, particularly online, which is a trend F1 do not want to be following, because there's one of the reasons why we're doing an F1 podcast instead of a football podcast is because the football online community is generally awful. And I really don't want to be seeing F1 go down the same road, but I'm seeing early signs of it, and I'm just hoping that things change.
Well, that and the fact that Lee doesn't really like football, and we support different teams anyway, so it'd be a very interesting podcast to do nonetheless, and probably one that take a lot more admin and effort than this one. So yeah, no, I totally get that, and I can understand why a lot of people are frustrated with what's going on, whether you're frustrated at the slander that's being landed at Red Bull's doorstep without the information or the facts, really. I think we all have to say this is all based on conjecture at the moment, and of course until the findings and the investigations are concluded and we see all the information that we hope we will see following this investigation, we can't really make a conclusion one way or the other. So it's a very strange one, and hopefully we'll get some information on that soon. Heard rumours that following obviously Dietrich Mateschit's passing that we're going to have to wait until the middle of the week, so perhaps by the time we do the Mexican Grand Prix preview we might know a bit more, but we'll have to wait and see. But once we do know more, of course, we'll talk about that on the next episode. And for those of you hoping that we'll stop talking about the budget cap, as soon as it's done and dusted, then we'll stop talking about it. But until
it's never
then,
going to end.
Well, no, it's it. This is it. I mean, it's not the most fun thing to talk about. I want to talk about the cars going brum brum and going around the circuit to entertain us on a Sunday afternoon. But all the politics and everything else that comes as a part of it, it's there. We'd be idiots to not, we have to talk about it. So,
Adam, I think you should do the sound effects of Formula One's intro. Boom, boom.
No, do you know who I?
Oh
God! Oh God! I've showing our age here, talking about old vines. The TikTok generation were like, "What is a vine?" It's like trying to talk about MySpace to someone that embraced Facebook.
Please?
No, I'm not doing that. No. If anything, if we had a bit more budget, I'd try and get that guy in from Kota a few years ago. You know, the one that was doing the neon noises. Yeah. Wow, what a legend he was. But yeah, let's talk about the racing now. Let's talk about the cars that go brum brum and everything else. Let's get back to that. I mean, a lot of surprises in the midfield today. I mean, Lando Norris. Where did he come from? Because he was nowhere today. And then in the final stint, when opportunities were there for him, he just came alive and dragged that McLaren to P6. And ultimately, it did make a little bit of a dent into the gap with Alpine. But I tell you what, that is a critically brilliant performance from Lando Norris to recover that and ultimately finish best of the rest, somewhere he's been very familiar with this season.
With a damaged car, I might add.
Yes, with a damaged car. Very, very good point. But yeah, what a drive from Lando.
Yet again, this is another example, and I've been holding back on this a little bit because I don't want to be too harsh on Daniel Ricciardo and the team in general. But this race has summed it up. Lando Norris has been carrying that team this season. I'll go as far as to say that. Lando Norris has been carrying that team. I had to look. Lando, very end of the race where Lando finished ahead of the Alpine. Obviously, Alonso had his accident, which contributed to that. But yeah, you're right. The McLaren was nowhere. Lando's got a decent haul of points for the McLaren. And I have a look. Where's Dan Ricciardo?
Last.
He was well, pretty much because we got Latifi. It was the cars that had been finished. Latifi, then Ricciardo.
Oh, Daniel got the Latifi. I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, that's the thing. So that for me, it just sums up the situation and why I do believe that Alpine would go on to win, because they've got two drivers that are picking up the points and a car that is a lot more consistent. The McLaren, you don't know what you're going to get week in, week out, but you know that you're going to get Lando Norris carrying the team. I think the geezer's going to have a backache by the time we get to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like Daniel was very much checked out at this point. I mean, he comes in on a Thursday afternoon on a horse in a cowboy outfit. I think the horse was like Horsey McHorseface or something like that, with its own VIP pass to get in, although it was Thursday only, apparently, so he wasn't allowed in the paddock at the weekend. But, you know, he comes in, he brightens up your timelines. He's a great guy, he's smiling, he's having a good time. People asking about his future. He reckons there's something lined up, probably going to be a reserve role. I heard Red Bull might be lining him up for a reserve role next season rather than Mercedes. But yeah, all that going on. And then qualifying, disappointing, going out in Q1 again. And in the race, yeah, even more disappointing. And I love Daniel Ricciardo as much as the next F1 fan, and I really want him to do well. But I think I can compare this to what Sebastian Vettel's doing. And maybe Sebastian, you know, he's not had the easiest last few years and he's had a hard time adjusting to this Aston Martin car in a similar way that Daniel Ricciardo has to the McLaren to some degree. But there's something that has to be said about the way that Sebastian Vettel is driving towards the end of his F1 career compared to Daniel Ricciardo, who equally could be in the same position right now and not know it at this point in time. And there's a lot to be said for that. And it's really disappointing that with someone that deserves so much as much as Daniel Ricciardo does in the sport, it's just so disappointing that right now we see someone like Lando Norris flourishing and Daniel Ricciardo looking like, one, he shouldn't be there, and two, perhaps he doesn't want to be there anymore, and he's just fulfilling a contract at this point rather than trying to actually, I don't know, maybe I'm being harsh, but looking at those performances right now, I feel almost like Nicholas Latifi could have got more out of that car today than him. And I don't think I'm exaggerating or being too harsh. What are your thoughts, Lee?
No, I do agree. I think Daniel's just completely demotivated. I mean, you go to anyone and you basically fire them, but it's a gut punch and you lose motivation. And he hasn't been happy in the car. And on top of that, you just lose the motivation to work. And if you're not in a happy place because you're not on top of the car, and you know you've been fired, right? You've got to see out your contract. It's there's no incentive initially to get back on. And it's down to your personality and a mental state on how you recover from that sacking. Some people rise to the challenge of being sacked and I'm not going to swear I was get on the proverbial horse and just go, yeah, I've got this talent. I don't care that you're firing me. I'm just going to go and put myself out there on the showcase. Bam, do some amazing performances. Or others don't, and then they just go down and get. I'm not saying Daniel has, but just suffer and go down into not depression, but lack of motivation and not delivering their best. And unfortunately, I think Daniel was more the latter, of not delivering his potential of then rising to the champion on display. You look at Sergio when he was let go at Racing Point. That was some of the best racing that we'd seen from Sergio at that point. It's like, bam, where's this Sergio been for the last few years?
Well, he won a Grand Prix, didn't he?
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's an example of what to do if you know you're being fired. And obviously, I'm not saying McLaren's a car to go and win a Grand Prix, but Daniel's not delivering the performance to justify another team having interest in him next year.
Yeah, very much. I think a great example of how I think this is sort of emphasised this weekend was the crash helmet livery design that he was inspired by for this weekend, and it was the famous I Want to Go Fast ME Cougar design that was in the film Talladega Nights with Ricky Bobby. And of course, for those people that haven't seen that film, first of all, go watch that film because it's absolutely hilarious with Will Ferrell and Sacha Baron Cohen. But the whole emphasis behind that livery design is that Ricky Bobby, the character, is coming back after a long injury where people are done with him, they're not interested in him, the sponsors don't want to associate with him, he's been fired by his team, wants to come back and redeem himself and drive for himself and just be fast and win a race, which ultimately he does. Ricciardo, by the same logic, you can resonate with that with his own career in the same aspect, that this is a guy that's a multiple race winner, not the 8-time world champion that the US Grand Prix announced and mistakenly announced him as, although that would have been quite interesting. But it's the same thing with Ricciardo, but this time you just don't see that same fire, that same level of drive, and perhaps this is a guy, and I hate saying this, but perhaps this is a guy that has already checked out and is just fulfilling a contract at this point. It's so sad to see. I hate to see it, very much less hate to say it, but that's just how I seem to feel Daniel Ricciardo right now. I feel almost a bit indifferent as to whether or not he's going to be in the sport anymore, because I just don't think he wants to be there anymore. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on it. I mean, obviously appreciate you guys sharing that as well. And obviously interested to hear what you guys think in the comments about Ricciardo right now, where you feel he's at, or where he's going to end up next season, whether it's a reserve role in F1 or retire altogether. We'll have to wait and see. Fernando Alonso, we should talk about with Alpine. Obviously a very, very contrasting day for him. Some good driving, but ultimately a very scary moment with a crash with Lance Stroll. I don't necessarily want to play the blame game or who did what, but it seemed very much an incident where both Alonso and Stroll probably were playing a little bit too close to each other and potentially played their own parts in causing that incident. What did you guys think? I mean, first and foremost, the most important thing is they were both okay, which is always a great thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think both of them need to sort of take a portion of the blame. I think you do get these situations sometimes when you have drivers on fresh tyres after a safety car, where you have that speed differential between the two drivers. You do get those kind of dangerous situations. It's very reminiscent, and it was mentioned in the commentary of Mark Webber and Heikki Kovalainen in Valencia a few years ago, because there's such a speed difference between the Red Bull and the Lotus that Kovalainen was driving at the time. Mark Webber misjudged the time to overtake, which led to him obviously doing a 360 in the air, which was obviously dramatic, but he came out okay, luckily. This wasn't as extreme, but I think this was the same situation. Alonso was so much faster than Stroll in that moment that I think they both misjudged the situation, and we had that kind of accident.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Lee, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it was very much 50-50. Fernando leaving it as late as possible to get the maximum slipstream on his fresh tyres, and Lance, a bit of a late defending. I think the most impressive bit is Fernando managed to drive away from that, go down to last, and then still finish 7th, which is
it would have been it would have been P6.
How the hell did he do that?
It would have been P6 if Norris didn't get him at the end. That was the surprising part. It's like, how did Alonso end up back in P6 like 5 laps before the end? Like, where the hell did that come from?
Yeah, it was regardless of the accident, it was a brilliant drive from Fernando, and just again showing the how good that Alpine can be. That he came from last to 6th, after having an accident and the damage and unknown damage that's probably on that car, because he had his tyres in the front wing change, but there's probably some other damage on that car as well.
Well, we saw
hit the wall.
Yeah, we saw a bit of weight saving going on there as well. We saw a bit of weight saving from a few people today. We had Perez, we had George Russell, we had Alonso losing that right wing mirror as well, and because obviously that got a bit loose, and then as he overtook, I think it was Kevin Magnussen and it just completely just went off as soon as the air resistant went back on it. But it was a very mixed day for Fernando Alonso. I think he'd have been happy with P7, considering that his car was very lucky to still be able to drive it. So I'm sure there was more damage going on there from what we saw. And it was nice to see the ground effect cars quite handy, that the car didn't flip over in the same way that Mark Webber's did all those years ago, as I'm sure it probably would have done if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of the downforce is generated on the floor now compared to how the F1 cars used to be. So I suppose that's somewhat of a success for the new cars. But a very scary moment between Alonso and Stroll. We should talk about Ocon, of course. Had to start from the back, from the pits. Was a bit up and down today. But we're coming to that point in the season now where we do have to keep an eye on the championship table. And whilst it's 11 points between McLaren and Alpine, I do want to pay attention a little bit, guys, to the battle at Alpine. Because Alonso's moving on to Aston Martin next season. So there's going to be huge bragging rights on offer here, especially for Esteban Ocon. If he's able to get one over on Fernando Alonso and beat him in the championship in the same car, it's now 7 points between them. And in truth, Alonso has been by far the better performer out of the two of them. But Esteban Ocon was really talking up how well he was doing this season and using the points tally between the two as a metric without any caveats or any other factors to go with that. It's going to be a little bit embarrassing for him after all of that talk for Fernando to pass him in the championship before the end of the season. The way things are going right now, you wouldn't bet against Fernando doing that. It's only 7 points between them.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a possibility, and we all know that Fernando will be pushed into the very last lap of the season. So, obviously, despite Ocon having the points advantage at this stage, you'd definitely put your money on Fernando Alonso having the high points total come the end of the season. But yeah, no, it's going to be a little bit embarrassing for Alpine, particularly considering obviously Alonso's leaving in the circumstances that he is and going to an Aston Martin team that's actually becoming quite resurgent and are certainly becoming more and more of a team to be keeping an eye on. With it seems that the improvement that's come with Aston Martin, we're taking on the fella from Red Bull. His influence and the upgrades that come along at Aston Martin. Even though Alpine seems to be optimistic about next year's car, we've really got to be keeping an eye on Aston Martin. So if Alonso finishes ahead of Ocon and then goes to an Aston Martin team that leapfrogs them next season, there's going to be very sour taste in that team.
Very much so. Speaking of which, should we talk about Aston Martin? Because, I mean, what a day. It could have been so much more for them. And, you know, despite Lance Stroll making a mistake which cost him the race and more points of that Aston Martin would have very much enjoyed in the Constructors Championship now, and they've gotten closer to Alfa Romeo, but losing those points from Stroll and some from Vettel, mind you, as a result of that incident, and obviously a pit stop issue later on, it still keeps them behind. But what a drive, though, from Sebastian Vettel in particular. And as you said, Courtney, this Aston Martin looks really good right now. It's getting there in qualifying. I think we have to heap a lot of praise on Lance Stroll in qualifying, and I think it was Tomo F1 on Twitter that really put this into perspective, and I've got to read this tweet out because I feel like it really doubles down on where Lance Stroll is starting to improve and make gains. And this is something that we don't often do on this show with Lance Stroll. We're very quick to criticise him when he does badly, but we should heap praise on him when he does well. And I think Tomo put it really well, so I'm going to quote his tweet here where he writes, "Historically, Lance's biggest issue has always been the one-lap quali pace. It feels like he's finally starting to get on top of that this year. Only 10-7 down in quali head-to-head to his four-time world champion teammate, who's arguably one of the best qualifiers around and in F1 history. Certainly nothing to be sniffed at. And he's still only 23 years old as well. Lance's racing craft has at times been questioned as well, but his pace has been evident, has always been his saving grace compared to his qualifying performance. And we saw him when he qualifies well. In the race today, until that incident with Alonso, he was ahead of his teammate. He was doing a good job battling away with Leclerc and was clearly the best of the rest until all that unfolded. So it's such a shame that it ended the way that it did, but it just goes to show Aston Martin really making gains. And not only is Vettel, but both him and Stroll are starting to make headway and really get the results in.
Yeah, I think, as I said, look, Aston Martin seems to be a team that eyes are starting to go on Aston Martin. You know, they formed as a team with lofty ambitions, was a little bit dubious about their intentions to start with, but they're slowly but surely building something. I've been very impressed with how they've developed into this part of the season. And I think the Lance Stroll situation has always been a real conundrum for the F1 fan base because there's always going to be the area judgment because his dad owns the team. And look, we've all been guilty of it. I've been guilty of it many a times. But you do sometimes go, well, he's only there because of his dad. Like I remember using another example. I think I mentioned on a podcast last year about when Frank Lampard played for West Ham. And obviously his dad played for West Ham and his uncle, Harry Redknapp, was the manager at the time. So some of the West Ham fan base thought that Lampard was only starting because of his family connections. And he went on to be one of the greatest midfielders the world has ever seen. So that is an example where sometimes we shouldn't be so quick to diminish Lance Stroll's accomplishments just because of his connections. Because no doubt that privilege would have helped him get into Formula One. But maybe sometimes we need to take a step back and not be so hasty and judge him purely for that.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Lee, what have you made of Stroll of late? Have you been impressed by his progress, or do you feel that there's still, well, I mean, there are obviously moments that have got to be refined. Hence today, of course, we saw the best and the worst, I suppose, of Lance Stroll.
No, I think I'm not one of his greatest fans, but he's definitely, you compare it to previous season, you can definitely see he's improved. He's improving. He's unlocking speed, especially you said in the qualifying. So he's definitely on his way. I didn't realize he was only 23, to be honest. I thought he was a bit older than that. More 25, not like 30 or something. But
and he's been around for a while, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize he was only 23. But yeah, he has been improving. And that Aston Martin is definitely improving. And it was a really solid drive from both of them until obviously Stroll's accident. And I mean, it was nice to see Sebastian leading a race, even if it was for a couple of laps. And I do think Lawrence would have really liked that nice red flag, wet rain, suspend the race. And like the first few laps when there was in 2 cars in the top 4, it's like, yeah, I'll take my half points or my quarter points just to claim like a podium and a 4th place. It's obviously it wasn't raining and it wasn't red flag, but I'm sure he would have loved loved that opportunity, bragging rights to say he got a podium on with the Aston Martin. Which I'm sure the way they're developing, next year, is Sebastian leaving a year too early? That's the question I want.
That's a good question.
Well,
that's a very good question.
This is it, isn't it? Because when it comes to Sebastian Vettel, and again, I've been loving what Sebastian Vettel has been doing right now. It feels like he's refound his passion for Formula One at the point where his career is sadly coming to an end. I mean, I know I said that there were rumours going around a little while back that Seb was scrambling around looking to see if there were any realistic options for a seat next year. Like he changed his mind on leaving the Aston Martin team after it had already been confirmed that he was going to retire. And I think we're seeing this in his performances right now. It just goes to show that when there's no pressure on him, when he's able to just do what he does best and he's enjoying himself, he's still without doubt one of the best drivers on the grid. It's been a good few years since we've seen that from Seb Vettel. I think it's fair to say probably even before the final Ferrari days, we never really saw that from him. And it's just so nice to see him doing so well. It's just such a shame that when he was in that position and took that final pit stop, that he was stuck there for about 16, 17 seconds, which ultimately was the difference today between finishing potentially somewhere like P5 or P6 and where he finished in P8. Recovered it really well, though. Put some great overtakes on. One round the outside.
My prediction was nearly right. I said there's going to be some more heroics from Sebastian Vettel, so I'm going to take like half a win from that.
Oh, you can if you want. That's absolutely fair. I mean, the outside on the overtake on Albon around the outside of, what was it, turn 18? That long right-hander was absolutely phenomenal. Also getting Kevin Magnussen, the way he was throwing that car about, losing control, but managed to hold onto it just to dive down the inside and make that move stick on Kevin Magnussen on the final lap was absolutely stunning. It's so... I think that everything seems right in the world when Sebastian Vettel is driving well and feeling happy, and that just makes the world seem like a better place when he is. It's just such a shame that, you know, we're only going to see it 3 more times and a sprint race as well.
What I think Lawrence should do, I know he won't, is put Lance as a reserve driver for a year and have Fernando in Aston Martin next year. Now, that would be a team pairing to watch.
Oh, wow. Could you imagine? I could not imagine a more stacked team partnership than that, arguably. I mean, has there really, in terms of comparing the accolades, I don't think there's been a more stacked partnership. I think you'd have to go as far back as Senna Prost. Really, to compare. But that or perhaps Lauda Prost
just for
as well.
A year, so Seb gets his year and just forget. I think that'd be brilliant. It won't happen, but what a team.
Well, I mean, when he comes up towards the end of his career, he'll be up to 299 Grand Prix starts. So perhaps there might be like a one day in there where he does a Hulkenberg, comes back for one race perhaps, and gets that nice 300. There's always nice for the OCD people out there that don't like seeing odd numbers. I'm certainly one of them in that regard. I'm the sort of person on the TV remote where it can't be on an odd number unless it's a 5. Otherwise, it just doesn't seem right. But I digress. Let's talk about Haas a little bit as well. Whilst we're here, Magnussen getting some points on the board. Big points for Haas in this championship battle, of course, with AlphaTauri, now that Aston Martin seem to have stolen a march on the pair of them. It's been a good day for Magnussen, not so great for Mick Schumacher, but I think we could agree that despite the fact that Magnussen got the result, Mick Schumacher's showing again that he's still probably faster than K-Mag right now, but just doesn't seem to have any luck. I mean, qualifying, he had the opportunity to try and get himself out of Q1, didn't, made that spin, which of course on his own accord, so you can't really say too much there. Didn't get much running in FP1 because Antonio Giovinazzi did a run for him, ended up crashing the car. So, you can't really put that on Mick Schumacher for once. And the race itself, Mick was driving pretty well for most of it, but just was so unfortunate with safety cars coming at the wrong time, and obviously an incident with Latifi wrecked his race, and he was fighting in the points for most of it. I think if it wasn't for that misfortune, he probably would have scored points today at a race where he probably really needed to.
Yeah, his situation seems to be so touch and go at this point. Obviously, even like the thumbnail from the last episode was, was it going to be Hulkenberg or Schumacher? And at this stage, I personally can't judge it. I really don't know the decision that Haas are going to make. I don't think deep down they do either, or they would have made a decision by now. But Mick is just at that level where he seems to be doing just about enough to keep the seat. But if Haas were to get, obviously a situation or a driver that could be quite appealing to them, it just seems to be right on the cusp. And the performances that Mick is putting in, the best thing that Mick is doing is he's bringing the car home, because the biggest issue with Mick has been the amount of crashes and obviously the cost bill that comes with that. So I just think if Mick does his best and nurses the car home in the next 3 races, he might just about keep his seat.
Yeah, it's a hard one to call. He's showing the pace, but he's just not getting that fortune, unfortunately, in bringing those points home. And arguably having the most expensive repair bill of anyone on the grid is not going to help for a team that does not need to be wasting money it doesn't have on trying to fix a car that at the moment they can't make go any faster as a result. I mean,
they can't make the car go. If the performance that Mick did, I really thought he was going to get some points early on in the race where he was running up with Kevin, and it was like he's going to bring it home, but he unfortunately didn't. But Kevin still had a brilliant race himself.
Yeah, he did. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to, is that Magnussen is now, in my mind, I think Mick has shown that he's faster than K-Mag at the moment, but Magnussen's the one that's getting the points.
The experience.
Yeah, and when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, points win prizes. You can, fastest lap technically does get you a point, but Mick's not getting a fastest lap any time. I mean, I know Magnussen used to have one in Singapore, technically still has the lap record, doesn't he?
He still has it, he does.
So, it's not impossible, but, Mick, and even if Mick did get a fastest lap, he'd have to finish in the top 10 to make it worth his while anyway. So, it's a tough one. I really don't know how this is going to go down. I kind of feel that perhaps Haas will take the punt on Hulkenberg if I was to bet on it right now. So. Purely for that reason where Hulkenberg perhaps is a bit more reliable and also probably a cheaper driver right now under the circumstances. But we'll see. We'll see. AlphaTauri, we already talked about Gasly. His race was kind of ruined by that 5-second penalty, which turned into more issues because they apparently AlphaTauri had an issue trying to serve the penalty correctly, which seemed a bit embarrassing. I'm not quite sure the details because we're quite fresh off this race, so we're obviously not finding out what's going on at the moment. But lots of strange stuff, and of course they're going to talk to him after the race or stuff like that after. It's all really crazy stuff. It's unfortunate for him because he was in a good point scoring position before that incident with Stroll and Fernando Alonso. So that kind of wrecked his race, unfortunately for him. Tsunoda did get in the points, mind you. So whilst AlphaTauri lost ground to Haas, they still kept them relatively honest on that one. So good for Tsunoda to get on the points once again. It's been a while since they scored points, so I think they'll be somewhat happy with that one today. Of course, on a weekend where they too will also be affected by the sad passing of Dietrich Mateschitz.
Yeah, I think if you have a look at the Tsunoda situation, that the way that he's performed this season compared to last, that's the example that Mick Schumacher needs to be following. Tsunoda's kept himself out of the headlines for all the wrong reasons, taking the limited opportunities he's having in an AlphaTauri team that seems to be faltering, particularly in the second half of the season. He's been keeping the racing clean, and I think that's the improvement we've been seeing from Tsunoda. And obviously with Pierre Gasly leaving, Tsunoda's going to have to consolidate this driving and then take his driving to the next level next season.
Yeah, very, very true. Of course, it will be to Alpine's gain as well, but yeah, a mixed bag from AlphaTauri, but back in the points again after a while, so obviously they won't be too disappointed with that one. But yeah, it's very close, that battle for P8 and P9 right now, and they definitely don't want to be finishing P9 when, of course, last season they had aspirations of finishing in the top 4. So yeah, quite a contrast for them that they'll have to try and sort out for next year. Let's talk briefly around about Alfa Romeo. Again, contrasting days for them. Qualifying, they look pretty handy. I mean, if it wasn't for Zhou having his lap time deleted, he would have started in the top 10 outright. So at the moment, he's seems to be doing okay. I mean, he was a bit unfortunate with the track limits, but as I said, rules are rules on this one, and it was a fair cop. But he's showing.
Want to negotiate?
Well, no, they didn't get the chance. I mean, we had this, didn't we? Something with Verstappen, and there were loads of images doing the rounds online. But the image they had of Verstappen breaching track limits in the first qualifying session, it was very, very close. It was much closer to the line than Zhou's one was. But I saw ones where Max Verstappen was in a different postcode, and I thought, well, that's not the correct image. That was from a different lap altogether, or something like that. So very, very weird stuff on that one. I think it was just people trying to make a point or an agenda or whatever you want to call it. So, but yeah, Zhou obviously had to start back. Didn't get the chance to negotiate his penalty or have a retrospective punishment or anything like that. So he had to start further down the order after his lap time got deleted from Q2. But he was faster than Bottas this weekend. Finished the race as well. Bottas making an error, losing control of the car at turn 19, beaching it in the gravel. As we've been saying for a while, it does seem that Zhou Guanyu seems to be doing a better job than Valtteri and seems to be showing a bit more pace than his experienced teammate. Do we feel that perhaps because Alfa Romeo have obviously been outdeveloped by their rivals to a degree? I know they brought an upgrade package which obviously showed some promise and showed some pace. Perhaps Valtteri is mentally checked out for this season.
Yeah, 100%. He's definitely on the. I've been saying this for about at least a month now. I think he's bored. I really do think he's bored, and I think he would enjoy the next few races with a invisible cocktail in one hand whilst he's driving. And I think that's the way to sum it up. Really, I think Guanyu Zhou, obviously he's new to Formula One. He's got the excitement of that. He's also got the excitement of F1 returning to China next season. So I think there's more motivation for Guanyu Zhou to perform at the moment compared to Valtteri.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I'm sort of trying to put myself in the mind of Fred Vasseur right now. Obviously, they've signed off this last upgrade package for the year. It does seem to have helped in terms of performance, but I feel like right now, they're so close to losing that P6 in the Constructors Championship, which at one point seemed that they were going to be fine. They were going to be safe as houses. Aston Martin have found this surge of performance and have slowly ate away at that margin. They should already be ahead of them at this point. The way that things went down today, Alfa Romeo were very, very lucky that Aston Martin, by their own misdemeanors and their own incidents, have lost points as a result. But I just feel it's only a matter of time before they lose it as well, and that's huge prize money. I think it's like $9 million the difference between P6 and P7. Million. So if you're Fred Vasseur, you must be, well, I know he ain't got much hair to tear out anyway, no joke intended, but if he did, he would really be worried right now about the fact that his star driver is beaching himself in the gravel, not performing, and Zhou Guanyu, as good as he's showing, the car is ultimately not good enough to compete with Aston Martin right now.
Yeah, I think if he hasn't already done so, he needs a good talking with Valtteri. I think Valtteri is struggling a little bit adapting to a team lower down the pecking order, and after driving off Mercedes, and just trying to find that new motivation that you need in a midfield team when you've been a race winner and been in a championship contender. Or maybe Fred needs to go and speak to Toto and go, how did you motivate Valtteri when Valtteri stopped being motivated? Can you give me any tips? Obviously, I'm not sure what Toto would say to that, but Valtteri can drive better than he's doing at the moment, and it's a shame to see he's not delivering it.
Yeah, no, I agree. He can drive a lot better than this right now, but maybe Courtney's right. Maybe mentally he's checked out and he's a bit bored and he's probably thinking about next season. I don't know, but there's still plenty to fight for this season. If you can't get motivated for this, then I'm not quite sure what you can do, really, to be honest. But I guess what's only Valtteri really knows right now. I'm sure he's probably asking those questions and trying to figure out what's going on right now. We'll finish off with Williams. as we often do on this show. And whilst it's no points for them, not that they're going to be too worried about that right now, they seem pretty much confirmed, nailed on for P10 in the Constructors Championship. There's another solid performance from Alex Albon. Qualified in P11, impressively. And, he was not too far off from getting into Q3 amazingly in the Williams, something he's done before this season. And also on top of that, he finished in a solid P12 in a crazy race where he was in the points for some time as well. So I don't think he'd be too disappointed with that. I think he'd be quite happy with that one. Donning the blonde hair this weekend seems to be a pretty good luck charm for Alex. Every time he changes his hair colour, he seems to put in a stellar performance. So we might see a bit of a rainbow of hair colours, a different array of hair colours from Alex Albon next season on that regard.
No, very, very much an example of Alex Albon. For me, I think Alex Albon's been one of the most impressive drivers this season, given the package he's had to work with. And also considering he was one of the drivers, who was sort of so browbeaten after his time at Red Bull, the way that we saw with Gasly. And obviously he hasn't rejuvenated himself the way that Gasly did so dramatically by winning that race in Monza a couple of years ago. But he's basically in his own way, he's had his own redemption arc with his performances at Williams, and I'm sure he'll be hoping that Williams can give him the car to get some points, because even like with George Russell's times at Williams, those sort of getting that car into Q3 and the little point scoring opportunities that he had, they were the moments that led to him getting his move to Mercedes. Obviously, yes, the partnership and the junior partnership with Mercedes obviously helped him get there, but it's those headline performances that help you sort of either build with the team that you're with, or they're like auditions to go to some of the bigger teams. So I'm sure Alex Albon and obviously the whole Williams team will be hoping to kick on next season, because they do, as you said, they're pretty much confirmed the worst team on the grid at the moment.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how that's going to go down. I mean, of course, we don't know whose teammate is going to be next season. Jos Capito apparently or allegedly saying that if Logan Sargent gets the required number of super license points, that he will be driving for Williams next season. I believe he has to finish in the top 5. And so basically avoid a disaster at the final race of the season in Abu Dhabi in F2 to make that, to pretty much sign, seal and deliver that, really. No pun intended, considering we're in Kota. But Nicholas Latifi, not too much to say on his performance this weekend. I mean, we saw a few moments of him where he had a bit of a spin early on in the race and carried on after a pit stop. Got a 5-second penalty for an incident with Mick Schumacher, finishing last on the road of the confirmed runners. I suppose the best news or the best thing to look at for Nicholas Latifi right now is the fact that it looks like he's going to be racing in IndyCar next season and possibly with Chip Ganassi Racing.
Yeah, well, it's good to see that he's getting his future outside of Formula 1 sorted. Obviously, any driver, they have to be in Formula 1. You still have to be one of the best drivers in the world. And he hasn't met Formula 1 caliber, but he's still a very good driver. And it's good to see that he's got his future secured for next season.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, he himself hasn't confirmed these rumours, although a lot of people have been talking in the paddock. and based on, when a rumour goes on in the paddock, based on what we've seen in recent events, it's more often true than not. But we shall wait and see. Guys, any final thoughts before we sign off this episode?
Looking forward to Mexico, and it'd be interesting to see if Sergio Perez wins, because my God, would the scenes there be fantastic if he was to win there?
Oh, yeah. It'd be absolutely bedlam, wouldn't it? What about you, Lee?
No, I completely mirror Courtney on that. COG winning Mexico would be a brilliant sign to see. The Mexican fan base will go wild, and that would be really a sight to behold, especially the arena part of it's going to be a really good sight if he can wins. But obviously, we'll get to that in the preview. Yeah,
that's very true. And I'd love to see the sight of Checo's dad if Sergio won in Mexico. That would be pretty special. I mean, he's usually a proud father when he sees his son come home in P20, so you can imagine how it'd be if he wins a Grand Prix in front of his own crowd as well. That would be it's definitely a sight for sore eyes, and certainly something I think a lot of us probably wouldn't mind seeing this season. But guys, that has been the end of the review of the United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. It's been an absolute classic, a brilliant race, so many events to talk about. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well, and I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. But of course, if you have any thoughts regarding the topics we discussed, please do let us know in the comment section. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you did enjoy it. It would really help us out a lot, and we would appreciate if you could offer your support to us in that regard. If you, of course, so I should say it again, if you listen to this show on your favorite audio podcasting platform, you can support us by offering us a 5-star review, which we will not negotiate on. We will take that, we will take that with aplomb, really, if you can give it to us. But of course, as a nice little incentive or bargaining chip, if you like, if you give us a 5-star review, we will give you a shout out on the next episode as a nice way of showing our support and appreciation for your support, I should say. It's a late one. You can tell it's quite late, shaking off a cold as well. So hope you guys can appreciate that if we miss a word every now and then. But until next time, guys, we will be back for the Mexican Grand Prix preview, and we'll be joined by Manena, otherwise known as A Girl Talks F1, to talk to us about her home Grand Prix, what she's looking forward to, and maybe a few snippets into what she's got planned for next weekend. But until next time, guys, please stay safe. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care, and thanks for tuning in.
See you soon.
Goodbye.